Democratic Congressman Darren Soto of Florida is also a co-sponsor of the Made in America drug legislation. I spoke with him recently. Let's listen. Congressman Soto, thank you for joining us. And we have been talking during the course of this conversation on some of the very real and serious shortages of drugs in this country, in part because of supply chain issues. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, how do we fix that?
Well, we saw during the height of the pandemic that we were woefully inadequate in our capacity for pharmaceuticals, especially both antivirals and eventually to be able to manufacture the vaccines that ultimately helped us get out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have the Made in America Act. It's a bipartisan act with Representative Buddy Carter and myself. Both of us are members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And of course, we are focusing quite a bit on that in the committee. It would provide 25 to 30% tax incentives to boost more domestic manufacturing so that we're not shipping drugs all the way across from the Pacific or from the Atlantic so that we're sourcing more raw materials here. It's about capacity. Certainly we'll still be importing pharmaceuticals going forward, but we have to build back our capacity, much like we're doing with the CHIPS Act, telecommunications, and other sensitive sectors of the U.S. economy.
So let me follow up on 2 points. First of all, are those tax incentives enough for U.S. drug makers to come back to the U.S. and to get to a level or a point that you're satisfied with? How long will that take?
Well, first, it'll be about our existing manufacturers boosting up their capacity or keeping lines of production open. That was a big issue, that there were lines that were closed during the pandemic that had to be reopened because you have to maintain them. And of course, some of that will be recruitment of new companies, but we're just trying to increase the capacity. And that remains still an open question that we'll have to be reviewing in committee because the bill hasn't been heard yet in committee. And it's something that I just spoke with Representative Carter today on, and it's something that we're going to continue to push going forward. We did see some discussion on it generally in the Energy and Commerce Committee, but these are questions we'll continue to ask. Will this go far enough?
And Congressman Carter are also part of this conversation, but let me go back to the issue of U.S. drug makers who are shipping or manufacturing some of their supplies in foreign countries, well over 100. China has about 13 to 15% of drugs that come from China to the U.S. Why such a disparity?
Well, I think we allowed through the total free market without having incentives for domestic production, just the natural exodus of U.S. manufacturing in the pharmaceutical area. We saw that in vehicles until we maintained trade in a better way. We are seeing that in microchips. But yes, right now, 72% of our pharmaceuticals are imported, 13% from China. And of course, they're an economic rival of ours. We've had issues with tainted products coming from there now and again. And we certainly don't want to be beholden to them. It's a different level when we're talking about importing from allies like Europe, Korea, Japan, and other allies across the globe. But it does put us in a vulnerable spot since they're not super transparent on how they do things. If something goes wrong, we learned that during COVID. And certainly we don't want to have to go try to investigate if there's a contamination of that 13% of pharmaceuticals coming from China. So this, again, is margins of improvement to increase capacity. It won't absolutely eliminate that, but it'll improve our own independent ability to handle both pandemics and shortage of drugs in the country.
But you use, Congressman, the word that we never want to hear, vulnerable, especially for a superpower like the U.S. So in the short term, what are your biggest concerns when it comes to these drugs and the shortage of drugs that impact so many Americans?
Well, certainly as a superpower, we have to recognize where we need to improve upon things rather than ignore them. And that's why Buddy Carter and I are taking this bull by the horns. We can, in the budget, in the meantime, improve funding for purchasing and for our national stockpiles as ways to do that. If the Congress would pass, particularly the Senate, the COVID supplemental that we've been asked by President Biden to pass, that would also continue to make sure there's a lot of funding in capacity, particularly for respiratory issues, which is one of the areas where there are shortages. So there's a couple things we could do in the short term as we're looking to more structural change in the long term. For the CHIPS Act, it took years to get domestic incentives to bring semiconductors back to the United States. It's something that we're slowly starting to see. So we know that something like a 25 to 30% tax incentive, depending on whether it's an economic opportunity zone and whether it's a high poverty area, then you get a bump in that. That is going to take a little while to get something ambitious like this done.
When you say take a little while, have you given any thought or any insight in terms of how long it would take? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years, perhaps even shorter? What is your time frame?
Well, we filed the bill this year, did not get the bill out of committee just yet. We're going to be working on it in the 118th Congress. So my hope is we could get it done in the next term, since it would be unlikely a bill that hadn't been heard and passed out of committee could get into the upcoming omnibus at the end of the year. In the meantime, there have been short-term incentives in this area through the American Rescue Plan. So it's not like no work has been done on it. We really had to boost up our capacity to ramp up the production of both the vaccine, COVID tests, and other pharmaceutical resources. So there has been a ramp up, but we don't want to be caught flat-footed again like we saw in 2020 when the pandemic hit our shores.
But it is bipartisan, as you mentioned, Congressman Carter, a conservative Republican from Georgia. So do you expect this to have a fairly easy glide path in the next Congress?
Whenever you're talking about large sums of taxpayer money to help incentivize industry, there's always going to be rigorous debate, as there should be. Like with the CHIPS Act, it's a similar concept. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in it, and we will both be pushing this in the 118th Congress. Whether or not it passes, we have a lot of explaining and defending this to our peers, but we all went through the pandemic together. We saw the shortages. We saw that we could have seen it far worse if we weren't well funded, but we can't rely on these major pandemic packages every now and again. We need a more consistent capacity so that these lines of production for everything from masks to pharmaceuticals to the raw materials, all these different things, we have a better domestic capacity overall for anything that comes our way.
And where's the White House? Where is the president on the Made in America Act?
Well, we have not heard a particular statement from President Biden, but I know he has been a champion of boosting domestic production and rebuilding our country. That's what the infrastructure law was all about. That's what the CHIPS Act was all about. And with the combating climate provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, he's been a big fan of that too. And we do know he's been aggressive in boosting American industries vis-a-vis China. And so we think he'll be supportive of it. And it's something we'll be engaging our White House liaison about.
And let me conclude with one final point, because it seems to me this is an area that would be relatively easy for Congress to put pressure on the FDA, and that is speeding up the process of some of these new drugs. I know it's an issue or a component of this debate that you have been part of. I wonder if you can address that.
Well, a lot of that we conduct through oversight. We and the Energy and Commerce Committee have oversight over FDA. And often if we'll hear companies, there's delay that is inexplicable, we'll inquire. We also believe in an independent FDA that can make the right decisions for public health. So it is a careful balance on how we speed up certain drugs. Of course, if it's an emergency, we could push for a waiver. But again, I still want to make sure, as we're in emergency situations, potentially speeding up, for instance, the vaccine to get it out in an emergency, that the science still governs at the end of the day whether a drug gets approved. So it is a give and take between the Congress and the FDA as far as how expeditious these drug approvals will be.
Representing Florida's 9th Congressional District and committee assignments, including the House Commerce Committee, Congressman Soto, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Steve.